Hey, it's Chris here again, and today I'm going to talk about persisting data via Spring Boot. In this case, I'm going to save it into MongoDB. So in the last video, we had created a REST endpoint, a very simple REST endpoint, which essentially returned a person. Now, I've updated this a little bit so that the person is a little more detailed. Let's just go have a look at this. So last time, our person only had a first name and a last name. I've added addresses. An address is just what you may expect it to be, although some interesting things. It does have some enumerations in here. The state is an enumeration, and the country is an enumeration. Likewise, the person now has a list of educations. Take a look at education, and it's got a name of an institution, the date the person enrolled, the date they completed, and the address for the institution. So pretty simple, but it makes the person a little more interesting. So all I've done from the video last time is I've just added more information to this person, given this person an address and one education record. Okay, so if I go over to my browser and I reload this person, well, I've already got it here. You'll see more than the first name and the last name. We've got the address information, the education information, and its address information. So the raw data. So I'd like to persist this somehow into a database. Now, in the past, I'm pretty sure what any of us would have done we would have started breaking this apart into relational database tables. So likely we'd have a person table, we'd have an address table, we'd have an education table, there'd be foreign keys all over the place. Then we'd have to start breaking this down into how we would save it. We'd use something to make it a little bit easier on us, an object relational mapper. I don't really believe in that too much anymore if I can help it. With the emergence of NoSQL databases like MongoDB, we can persist this data more natively. So as we said back in the JSON output, well, you could make the argument that this is the native format for this data. If I were to persist this to a file, I could pull it back out of a file and I could unmarshal it into a true person again. I could use a library like JSON. But even now, our application is making the translation from the object model to JSON really easily for us. Now, the nice thing about Mongo is it's a document database. It's a NoSQL document database, and it stores JSON-like strings natively. So it seems that it would be really convenient to just take these JSON strings and store them directly into Mongo. So how do we do that with Spring Boot? It's actually extraordinarily easy, as most things are with Spring Boot. So let's start by having a look at how we would do this. So we have a REST endpoint here. I'm going to add a new package for, I'll call it persist. You call it whatever you like. And I'm going to create a new, it's actually an interface. So we'll call this person repository. Now, Spring Boot has this concept of repositories. Spring Boot defines a repository top-level interface, and this top-level interface is to provide a certain degree of magic for dealing with databases. I'll explain a little bit about the magic in a moment. So I'm going to make this extend one of the sub-interfaces of that top-level repository interface, and it's going to be a Mongo repository. The thing about these top-level interfaces is they also take what we're going to be persisting, in this case a person, and also we have to describe what the main ID would be on our entity that we're saving. So I'm going to say our top level ID will be a string. Okay. So obviously I'm going to import that. Then the Mongo repository. Oh, of course, I don't have it yet because I need to add a Maven dependency for this. Let me just go to the pom.xml file. And we had the Spring Boot Starter Web, which gave us our embedded Tomcat and all that nice REST endpoint stuff. I'm going to put a dependency in here. So most of these are org Spring Framework Boot group IDs. And the artifact ID is the MongoDB starter. Okay, so again, Spring Boot is a code by convention framework. Just by adding this dependency in, it will know how to configure Mongo. Okay, so if I go back to my person repository, I will import this, Alt-Enter, import class. So there. Now, right away I actually have functionality in this repository. So if I actually control-click on Mongo repository, IntelliJ is actually going to decompile this for me. And we can see it provides methods like find all, insert, and I mean there's even more because this extends additional interfaces. So there's a certain amount of functionality baked in. Now you may ask yourself, how can there be functionality baked in? This is only an interface. And that's where the magic comes in. So Spring Boot, when it sees one of these interfaces, what's actually happening in the background is it's constructing a concrete implementation of this interface that provides the functionality you require. You're telling it, I need a way to get persons out of a Mongo repository. And it creates a class for you. As programmers, sometimes we distrust magic if we don't understand how it works, but with Spring Boot, generally if you go with the flow, you'll do okay. So I've created the repository. How would we actually go about using this thing? Well, why don't we go pop into this JUnit test class, okay? This is the default test class that was given to me by the Spring Initializer. I'm going to use it to drive data into my Mongo database. So what I maybe will do is I'll actually go into the REST controller and I will just grab the construction of this person. And I'll create a private method. Oh, and it needs a simple date format parser. So I'll just go grab that from up here. Okay. So I have a private method for creating a person. I will hit Alt Insert and create a test method, and the test will be persist. Normally you wouldn't create a test that would persist somebody. You wouldn't typically create a unit test that would connect to a live database of any fashion and do anything with it. But this is for demonstration purposes, so that's what we're going to do. So that repository, this test is going to need access to that repository. So what we can do is we can say auto-wired, and I'll create a private what do I call it? Person repository. Okay, and I'll create a getter and setter for that. So what's going to happen is this is going to run with the Spring Runner, and it's defined as a Spring Boot test. When Spring initializes, it will see that it needs to auto-wire the person repository. It'll go find the person repository and magic up a concrete implementation of this thing for us. All right. So if I say I'm going to create a person, and if I say null, it should default for me to Bart. That's what we had last time. And I'm going to go and say repo.save person. Alrighty. Any build problems? There are some build problems because this throws an exception, which I'll add. And being very lazy, I will just throw all exceptions out of this guy. So it looks like this build's clean. So before I run it, let's open a terminal window and have a look at Mongo very quickly. If you're not familiar with it, it's fairly simple. So I have Mongo pre-installed on this machine. For me, I would have done a sudo apt install MongoDB. Of course, I'm running Ubuntu. Your mileage will vary, but I'm sure you can figure out how to install Mongo. Now Mongo has a command line client, just Mongo. So here I'm connected to it, and I can say show collections, and I only have one collection here, which is another one from another project. I don't have any collection to do with this guy yet, so let's just leave that at that, and let's go ahead and run this test. So again, after this person is created in memory, we're going to persist it into the Mongo database. You may ask yourself, how does it know which Mongo database to connect to? Well, we'll get to that as well. Okay, so it ran green. Let's see if it actually worked. If I head back to my terminal here and I say show collections again, well, look at that. I have a person collection. So what you can do is you can say db.person.find, and this will list all of the persons in that collection. Okay, so have a look. That looks like the JSON string more or less that we had from before. What's different is there is an auto-generated ID here with an object ID, and it's a crazy long string. I suspect that's a UUID, a universally unique identifier. Remember, in the repository, we said that our person was identified via a string. The ID is a string, and Spring did exactly what we asked it to do. It managed to generate an ID for us with a string. Mongo, you can actually do things like find.pretty, because we love beautiful things. And there's our JSON prettified. And there's a little bit extra. There's a little class in here, which I believe is probably a hint so that when Spring pulls this back out again, it can recreate our person. Okay? So there's insertion. Extraordinarily simple. Extraordinarily simple. Now let's go change our REST endpoint, because right now it's all hard-coded. So what we're going to do is instead we're going to, now we're not going to need this thing anymore. I'm going to auto-wire So I'm going to auto-wire that person repository, and I will insert a getter and setter for it there. And what I want to do is I want to change the getPerson method so that no longer is it returning me something hard-coded. It's actually going to go and obtain this person from the Mongo database for me. So what I'll do is, if first name, let's say, is null, I'm going to default it. I'm kind of trying to make it work kind of similar to the way it did before. So if we don't specify first name, we're going to assume it's Bart. And I'm going to get rid of all of this stuff. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to go and query the database. So we want to be able to find by first name, right? So if you ask yourself naturally, how would I do that? Wouldn't it be nice if there was a method in that repository that would be find, say, find by first name. And I could just pass in the first name. And I could just return the person that would come from it. That would be really, really nice. But of course, we don't have such a method. If I hit Alt-Enter, it gives me the option to create that method in the person repository. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And that's the default method signature that it provides for me in this interface. Now, as I said, these repositories in Spring Boot are sort of magic. And this turns out to be all I need to provide it. Because when Spring analyzes this repository interface, it says, find by first name. Oh, okay, I need to find by the first name in that JSON string. Can I do that? Actually, it figures out how to do that. It's like somewhat miraculous. So let's stop that application and start it again. Oh, I'm running the test application again. Maybe I should kill that. Let's start the REST application again. And I'm just going to make sure it didn't insert any additional records there. It didn't. Okay, my app is up and running. So, okay, first off, I'm going to provide the same thing, first name Homer. We know there is no Homer in the database right now. The only thing we have in the database right now is Bart, I believe. That's right. So if I run this, it shouldn't give me anything really. and it didn't. If we actually change this to first name Bart, look at that. Now that is super cool. This came out of the database, out of the Mongo database. Homer didn't return anything because Homer doesn't exist in the database. We can go and mess with this guy, and maybe I will create Homer. And I'll run that test. Again, running this via a test is like the worst thing in the world, but it's what I'm doing. Okay, I should have Homer now, so let's go. Looks like I have Bart and I have Homer. So I shouldn't even need to restart my application because after all I changed was the data store. So say Homer. And he comes back as well. So super duper powerful. I really like MongoDB. It's going to be my go-to for any persistence if I can help it. And I mean, the reason is this object tree could be extraordinarily deep, and it just figures it out. It just figures it out because you can marshal anything into JSON, into a JSON string, and then you can persist it into a database who expects JSON strings natively. MongoDB is a document database, so it's absolutely fantastic. So one last question you might have is, how does it know which database to connect to? Well, as I said, Spring Boot is a coding by convention type framework. It's assuming that Mongo's running on the default port. It's assuming it's running on localhost. And it's assuming it doesn't even need any credentials to log in. If you remember, when I connected to Mongo via the terminal, it didn't ask me for any credentials. Probably that's not going to be a realistic situation for a production application. So the way you override these things is under source main resources, there's an application properties file. And you can use the application properties file to override certain defaults. So in our case, what you can say is you can say spring.data.mongodb.host. I'm going to say it's localhost. So that's to set the host, and you can set the port. And I'll again set it to the default port. But I like to be declarative. I guess I said just go with the magic, but in this case, maybe I don't want to go with the magic totally. So, and the database, you can actually provide it a database name if you like, PersonDB, let's say. And you can even provide a username and a password. Username and password. So now, of course, I don't have this user and password set up in my MongoDB. So I hope you guys found this useful. I'm going to continue the series on Spring Boot. Please stick around. I've got other videos on my channel. I'd love it if you could like my videos or subscribe. And thanks again for watching.